Hey, gun people. Okay, here we go. Day whatever on the, it's Wednesday. The defense should be finishing up today or tomorrow. It may go into Friday, but we don't know. He's given the judge a list of his, witnesses. So he's calling a doctor now. So this is going to be his medical expert. Again, I'm going to bump through his qualifications and all that shit. Unfortunately, the judge and the jury can't bump through, and they got to listen to all this. So here we go.
You're about to give me the truth and nothing but the truth.
I do. Thank you so much.
Having you state your full name, spelling each of your names.
My full name is David Richard Fowler. David, D-A-V-I-D, Richard, R-I-C-H-A-R-D, Fowler, F-O-W-L-E-R.
Mr. Nelson.
Thank you very much. Dr. Fowler, are you presently employed?
I am retired.
Okay. Could you tell the jury a little bit about what you did prior to your retirement?
Prior to my retirement, I have been full-time in forensic pathology since about 1986, which is when I first started training in that discipline. And I have been full-time within that discipline for 30-some years, whatever that number is.
Where did you work prior to retirement?
I worked at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner for the state of Maryland.
Do you have any other employment either before your retirement or subsequent to your retirement?
Yes, I would do the occasional consultation case during the time prior to my retirement, and I have done some since my retirement.
Could you tell us a little bit about your education and background?
Certainly. I graduated from the University of Cape Town in South Africa in 1983. I then did a year of internship in general medicine and general surgery. That's required in South Africa before you can get a medical license. I then followed that with a year of training in pediatric pathology at the Red Cross Children's Hospital in Cape Town. And completing that year, I entered a full-time 5-year training program at the University of Cape Town in forensic pathology.
And are you board certified?
I am. And so the system in South Africa is that you eventually graduate with a Master of Medicine in your discipline. So I ended up with the Master of Medicine in forensic pathology, which qualifies you in the South African system to be what they call a specialist, which in this country is the same as an attending physician, just different terminology. That's equivalent to board certification here. When I came to the United States, I felt it was very important to get an American qualification if I was going to work in this country full-time. And so I went back, and the American Board of Pathology demands that all pathology training is done in the United States or Canada. So, if I wanted to do that and be eligible for their examination process, I had to then go back and retrain. So I went to the University of Maryland for 2 years to complete additional anatomic pathology training to qualify me for that portion of the examination process, and then 2 years of forensic pathology training at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner. I then took my board examinations through the American Board of Pathology in anatomic and forensic pathology, and passed those exams.
Great. So how did your career progress after you received all of that education?
So at about the time that I finished my training, I was recruited full-time into the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner as an assistant medical examiner. And that was, I would have to look at my CV to be absolutely certain, 95 or 96, somewhere in that range.
Are you a licensed physician in the United States?
Yes, I am.
Now, you were educated in large part in South Africa, but then also here in the United States. Are there some differences between the degrees, or are they the same?
They're different letters after your name. But so if you go through the system which is derived from the old British examination process, you end up with a MD-CHB, and some of them have different letters, which basically mean you have 2 bachelor's degrees, a Bachelor of Medicine and a Bachelor of Surgery. And it's a 6-year training program, not a 4-year training program like you have in the United States. Just different ways of getting to the same end point. If you want to work as a physician in the United States, you have to go through a process, which when I went through it was run by the Educational Commission for Foreign Medical Graduates. And they make an assessment as to whether or not the university that you went to meets the appropriate standards. And these are all universities that are approved by the World Health Organization as meeting certain standards. Once you've been approved and your university is recognized, then you have to go through a set of board examinations, which are very similar to all US graduates graduating from a US university. So nowadays they are known as the USMLE examination. So we go through exactly the same process for evaluation. And then you can apply for a medical license in the United States based on that process.
Okay, thank you for explaining that. And in terms of, just to clarify, you are a licensed physician?
Yes, I am.
All right. And you have board certifications in forensic pathology and anatomic pathology, that's correct?
Yes, I do.
And you worked as a pathologist or a forensic pathologist?
Qualified. I've had an interest. I started because they work in the laboratory in a hospital. So, having finished my training in forensic officers, the coordination and supervision of that falls to the Deputy Chief for statewide services. So having service...
Until your retirement?
Yes, it was about 17 years in that position.
So what type of work is done at the medical examiner's office? I mean, you've explained kind of the differences in the statewide versus the autopsies.
So the difference between what's done in the hospital and what's done at the medical examiner's office is, in the hospital, the pathologists are looking largely at natural disease. There will be some traumatic specimens come from trauma patients, but most of what they're doing is looking at natural disease. The forensic pathologist is an individual who's gone on to do that additional training in wound patterns and other non-natural events that threaten life and cause death. So at the end of the process, you have the knowledge base of all the natural diseases that a general pathologist has, plus the additional training to evaluate how people die in unusual circumstances, sudden deaths while not attended, or any deaths which are traumatic. So that's the additional training. That portion is what's done at a medical examiner's office, are these sudden, unexpected deaths. And so the best way of thinking of a medical examiner's office is a 24-hour emergency medical institution. People die all the time. It's got to be available 24 hours. All of these deaths, you need to respond to them rapidly and appropriately and in a dignified way. So it's a 24-hour emergency medical institution with the one responsibility at the end of the day of making a determination of the cause of death of the individual that has suddenly died.
In addition to your work at the medical examiner's office, did you also do some teaching?
Yes.
Where?
So I've taught at the University of Maryland. I'm a professor in both pediatrics and pathology at that particular institution. I've taught at the Johns Hopkins Hospital. I've taught at multiple hospitals in the guest lecturer. And in other words, when a forensic pathologist trainee, what we would call a fellow, is doing a case, I would be directly supervising everything that they did on that case. And it would be my responsibility to ensure the autopsy table. When I became deputy chief, I continued to do that, but one of the roles that was assigned to me was the residency director position for the office. And so that is the position where you supervise the residency program and how that program is accredited, complete a declaration that they have met the standards in order to practice quarterly.
Those are peer-reviewed journal type information?
Both publications and presentations.
I approached, you were approached by me, correct?
I believe that was the first conversation I had, yes. It was a while back.
And you referred me to the forensics panel?
That's my recollection, yes.
Now, in terms of this particular case, how many of these peer reviewers were ultimately involved?
There were 13 peer reviewers across multiple disciplines that were involved in this case.
How was it useful for you to have those peer reviewers involved?
Well, several of the peer reviewers, I believe 7, are forensic pathologists, so my direct colleagues, with the same training and skill set that you would expect a good forensic pathologist to have. There were additional individuals in behavioral health, pulmonary, pulmonologists, emergency room physicians, toxicologists that were present as part of the evaluation team because they have the detailed knowledge in those other areas that really helps critique any opinions that I may form and provide their expertise in ensuring that everything was looked at and that any opinion that is expressed is based in science.
What's the process that you apply in approaching a case such as this?
So the primary reviewer in a case like that will be provided all of the available information that has been given to the forensic panel. They will go through that material, study it, evaluate it, and then the peer reviewers are given a similar but sometimes slightly less onerous package of materials, but they are given similar materials. They will go through it, and then I would, in this case, as I did in this case, I've been a review pathologist on several, and in this case I was the primary, I will do a presentation to the forensic panel. And during that time, they have the opportunity to evaluate and critique my opinion. Based on that, if there's additional information that is necessary in order to help refine the opinions, that request can go back to the forensic panel and through to whichever attorney, whether it be a prosecutor or a defense attorney, plaintiff's attorney, or a defense attorney. Requests for the appropriate additional information can be made, and if that information is available, sent back so we can complete and try and ensure that we haven't missed anything. So there may be several reviews along the way. And then at some point, if the
to the narrative made of response and Your Honor approach the bench.
Sidebar.
Sidebar, I couldn't hear the objection.
All right. Dr. Fowler, are you familiar with NAME?
Yes, I am.
And what is NAME?
NAME is the National Association of Medical Examiners.
And are you a member of NAME?
I am.
Have you held any leadership positions in that organization?
I have, yes.
Can you, well, let me ask you this. Does NAME have an inspection and accreditation process?
Yes, it does.
Or committee, I should say.
Yes, it has a committee which does that particular task for the organization.
What is the responsibility of the inspection and accreditation committee?
to evaluate medical examiner and coroner officers. It's a voluntary program, and basically it means that the medical examiner's office, once they've passed that evaluation and been accredited, have met certain standards that the National Association of Medical Examiners Board.
I don't know if anybody else sees it. To me, it looks like he had a beard and he shaved it because of the skin color. But not that that matters. I just noticed it while I was talking.
Board of directors believe are appropriate for the office to have in order to ensure the safety of both the staff that work in the office and also the community that they serve.
Are you a member of that committee?
I am now, and I was a previous chairman of that. Two separate committees. Committee at the qualification checklist is approved by the board of directors. Suggest those are and debate those as to whether or not 2005 to keep them appropriate and fresh.
Can you tell me generally what a death investigation is and what it involves?
Yes, a death investigation is very much like any other medical examination, but specifically looking at individuals, obviously, who have died. So there is gathering of information from the scene of the death, and that is somewhat to replace the information that a patient would give to their doctor when you walk into the examination room. Your doctor, the first question they'll ask you is, why are you here today? Well, deceased people can't speak, and so therefore the scene information really replaces some of that information. You gather the scene information, you gather past medical records, you then start gathering information from all sorts of pertinent sources. That will be the ambulance or EMT run sheets, the hospital information if the person made it to the hospital, the current medical information, the past medical information. There'll be witness statements, there will be, and we'll use, yes, so if a specimen is taken in the hospital, that will be taken. If clothing is available in the hospital and removed from the person, to actually define how the case, so yes, hospital specimens. If the person, for instance, went into surgery and a specimen was removed from them during the surgical procedure to try and save their life, that would also be requested. So there's lots of things that you would try and get.
And is there then, ultimately it results in a death certificate?
Well, there's a long process which goes on before that.
How long does that process take?
So the process would include an autopsy, which is an external examination of the person, an internal examination of the person, maybe x-rays of the person, CT scans of the person, depending on the resources and needs of the case. Additional specimens will be taken at the time of autopsy to look at under the microscope and or send off to a toxicology laboratory. And I'm talking very generally. Every case is going to be different. At the end of that process, you begin the evaluation of the case. In complex cases, certain specimens will be retained and often sent to an expert in that particular area. So some officers have access to a neuropathologist who specializes in looking at brains and spinal cords. So if you have that resource, and it's a case where that really may well assist in getting the additional detail that a specialist who only looks at that can provide, then you'll say that's...
I'm thinking he's going here because he would have said he would have sent his heart to a specialist, but we'll see.
Specimen and have them look at it in conjunction with you. So it's usually an examination of the two with that extra expertise at the same time.
Are there other factors or other processes that occur?
Yes, and you know, some officers have access to cardiac pathologists. The Maryland office does, and so in many of these complex cases, the heart would be retained and examined by a cardiac pathologist. And you have, in fairness, a general forensic pathologist has a substantial body of knowledge and is very good at identifying most things. But there are cases when somebody who only looks at that one organ is going to have a better eye for detail in that particular area. And so you can do that. Not all officers have access to those resources, but if you have, that's a good thing. So those all add time to waiting for those examinations to be done and the results to be sent back so they can be put into the evaluation matrix and the jigsaw puzzle of all of the information that you're trying to include, as well as the toxicology results, which take a while to come back, the microscopic examination, which the pathologist will do themselves. It takes a while for the glass slides. So some cases can take 2 to 3 months. And NAME actually has a requirement that you should complete 90% of your cases within 90 days. Otherwise, you cannot be accredited. They prefer you to do it within 60 days, but 90% of cases should be completed within 90 days. That's 3 months. And the 10% of cases that aren't completed with it are going to be very complex cases. Often the deaths in custody and the pediatric sudden deaths are the ones that fall into that 10%. So they often go out.
Death certificate is ultimately a death certificate is issued, right?
Correct.
And can you explain what the death certificate is?
So the death certificate is a document that is produced by a physician. The greater majority of them are signed out by physicians within the hospital or nursing home, etc., when people die of natural deaths. Medical examiners are usually exposed to about 25% of deaths within their jurisdiction. So the death certificate is a certification that the person has died, and within a reasonable degree of medical certainty, the certifying physician believes that whatever is on the cause of death line is the cause of death within a reasonable degree of medical certainty.
So let me ask you, in terms of this particular case, you've reviewed a substantial amount of information.
Yes.
Can you just briefly describe the information you've reviewed in this case?
Gosh, it goes on for several pages, but there are past medical records, there's toxic surveillance, video material from Toxicology. It goes on and on and on. There is a substantial amount of information on this case.
And before we kind of get back to the death certificate in this particular case, upon your review and based upon your training and education, your experience as a forensic pathologist, have you formed opinions in this case to a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
Yes.
We'll come back to those shortly. So in terms of the death certificate, are there two parts to that?
Since he's going to agree with why he died and probably disagree with the defense, I would have let him say that and say, we'll come back to it later. Because you want the jury to hear that multiple times. Just like the prosecution has played the video 1,000 times. They keep repeating their same theme. They want the jury to hear it. He should have let him say what his determination was, and now let him justify it, and then at the end ask him again, what was your determination? And the jury hears it again. I think that's the way I think it would have been better, personally.
Yes.
And can you explain those two parts?
So the first part is what the physician believes to be the cause of death. So that is something that you will put, what we call part one, that's what the CDC refers to it. The death certification process is one which is controlled and governed by the CDC, although each state will have a slightly different format to their death certificate and the way they do things. The guidelines that are put out there by the CDC for completion of death certification are certainly ones that are national.
So what's the first part of the death certification according to the CDC?
Well, the first part is the primary cause of death.
Right. And what's the second part per the CDC?
Other significant conditions contributing to death, but not directly related to what's in part one.
Now, I'm going to like to show Exhibit 193, which is already in evidence. Do you see that in front of you and ask this document?
I have seen this document, yes.
And what is the first part of the certification of death?
So the first part here, the cause of death, is cardiopulmonary arrest, complicating law enforcement, subdual, restraint, and neck compression.
Now, under that, there's a phrase that says underlying. Is that what you're talking about in terms of the second part per the CDC?
No, the way the CDC normally phrases it is you can break it out into multiple lines. So it could be cardiac arrhythmia due to such and such, due to such and such. And so that's where the underlying conditions come into the death certificate. At least, when you look at the CDC guidelines and the death certificates that I'm used to completing. The second part that I refer to as part two on this death certificate is called other contributing conditions.
And what are the other contributing conditions that you review here?
And so on this particular death certificate, the certification says that atherosclerotic and hypertensive heart disease, fentanyl intoxication, and recent methamphetamine use are considered contributing conditions.
So this was prepared by Dr. Baker, correct?
Yes, that is my understanding, that he was the individual who certified this case.
So in terms of Dr. Baker's analysis of this case, how did the heart and drugs contribute to the cause of death?
They were significant, or they contributed to Mr. Floyd having a sudden cardiac arrest, in my opinion. That's how I would read it.
Okay. So I'm going to take this down. If we could unpublish that. Doctor, did you prepare a PowerPoint presentation to walk through your opinions in this case?
Yes.
To publish.
Interjection to 1098 for demonstrative purposes only. All right, it is received for that purpose alone.
Now, if you remember, they were talking about demonstrative purposes only for demonstration. That means the jury won't get this because they're just using it for the demonstration, but the jury doesn't get this when they go into deliberations. That's kind of how they let some things in, but the jury don't have access to it, even though they saw it during the trial.
So before we begin, Doctor, can you summarize briefly what your opinions are in this case?
Yes. So in my opinion...
See, he did do it. You want to tell him what you're going to tell him how you got there, and then tell him what your conclusion is again.
Mr. Floyd had a sudden cardiac arrhythmia due to his atherosclerotic and hypertensive heart disease, or you can write that down multiple different ways, during his restraint and subdual by the police, or restraint by the police. And then his significant contributory conditions would be, since I've already put the heart disease in part one, he would have the toxicology, the fentanyl and methamphetamine. There is exposure to a vehicle exhaust, so potentially carbon monoxide poisoning, or at least an effect from increased.
The exhaust wouldn't be Chauvin's fault per se, but the prosecution is going to go, wouldn't a reasonable officer paying attention to things, wouldn't he be breathing that, and wouldn't it be affecting him? And remember, the vehicle was a battery and engine, and when they tried to start the vehicle, they couldn't get the engine to run. So we don't know if there was carbon monoxide or not coming out of the tailpipe.
Carbon monoxide in his bloodstream and paraganglionoma, or the other natural disease process that he has. So all of those combined to cause Mr. Floyd's death.
All right. So let's walk through each of these, if we could, starting with the opinions of Dr. Baker as far as the cardiopulmonary arrest. Before we do that, if we could publish the exhibit, Your Honor.
This is a document that is produced as a guide for medical examiners to use when certifying the death, and specifically the manner of death.
What is the manner of death?
So the manner of death is, how did the cause of death come about? And you have 5 different choices that you can check off or write down on a death certificate as to the manner of death.
Now, does this document specifically address asphyxial deaths, positional asphyxia deaths?
It addresses all sorts of manner of death, and again, it's a guideline put out there to assist medical examiners. And unfortunately, not every case cleanly fits into one particular category or meets the criteria for the guidelines.
Okay. So let's talk about, in terms of the second slide, positional restraint. How does NAME deal with the autopsies and death investigations involving potential positional restraint?
So the recommendation is that, or it's a recommendation, they say, you may be classified as a homicide.
Okay.
It doesn't say shall or should, it says may be classified as a homicide. Again, we have to recognize that these are medical guidelines. And it then goes on, and everybody, I think, can actually easily read that. If you want to go back one, and in such cases, there may not be intent to kill, but the death death results from one or more intentional, volitional, potentially harmful acts directed at the decedent, without consent, of course. Further, there is some value to the homicide classification towards reducing the public perception that a cover-up is being perpetrated by the Death Investigation Agency.
Now, in terms of the 5 manners of death that you described, again, we've heard testimony, or the jury has heard testimony from other experts who've testified. There's homicide as one, suicide. Can you describe the others?
So homicide, suicide, accident, natural, and then undetermined.
So this next slide, can you describe what undetermined means according to the guidelines?
So according to the guidelines, undetermined, or the other term on some death certificates is could not be determined, is a classification that's used when the information pointing to one manner of death is no more compelling than one or more other competing manners of death, in thorough consideration of all available information.
Oh, I bet he's going to say he would have put this death as undetermined because it was multiple. Watch this. I could be wrong.
And the guidelines also define homicide?
Yes. And again, homicide occurs when a death results from a volitional act, in other words, an act a person did, committed by another person to cause fear, harm, or death. Intent to cause death is a common element, but is not required for classification as a homicide. More below. It is to be emphasized that the classification of homicide for the purposes of death certification is a neutral term, and neither indicates nor implies criminal intent, which remains the determination within the province of a legal process.
Why is that second part important?
Because this is a medical opinion that is on a death certificate. The manners of death are unique, or virtually unique, to the United States of America. These were put on the death certificate by the Center for Disease Control in order to gather information as to how Americans died or die for epidemiological purposes, and to study and try and prevent deaths.
So the death certificate really isn't a legal document. It's a stat document for the CDC.
They are not meant to usurp any kind of legal process. And in fact, in many circumstances, regardless of what the medical examiner puts on a death certificate in whatever manner, the legal system can and will act in a completely independent and different format.
Okay. Now, again, we discussed a little bit about the CDC death certificates, the instructions. Is this the guideline by the CDC?
Yes.
And it is to enter all diseases or conditions contributing to the death that were not reported in the chain of events?
In part 1, in the first part, yes.
Now, back to, and if we could take this down for a moment, Your Honor. So with respect to Dr. Baker's autopsy, I just want to talk a little bit about the cardiopulmonary arrest that he references. What are the findings that were relevant to your analysis in this particular case?
there are substantial pertinent negatives in this particular case that drove my opinion.
What about the size of the heart?
So there are, again, certain pertinent positive issues. Mr. Floyd's heart was enlarged. There are multiple methods and studies that have been done on the size of the heart in the United States. There's one study out of the medical examiner's office in San Antonio, Dr. Molina and DeMaio, where they took a series of individuals who died suddenly with trauma and hopefully eliminated, as part of that process, natural disease that might have caused alterations in the heart size.
Excuse me, doctor. Did you prepare a slide relevant to this, and if we could publish
Yes, I
it?
did.
Okay. So the Molina study you were referencing?
Right. So in their study, they found that 95% of males had a heart weight between 233 and 383 grams. Anybody outside of those limits, and you would expect about 2.5% to be lower and 2.5% to be higher. That's the 95% certainty on either side of the mean. And so that is what they proposed as being the reference range for adult males.
Now, how about the Mayo study?
So the Mayo study is one where you can go in and calculate the weight based on the size of the individual, which is potentially more accurate. Because you don't really want to take 130 pound, 5'5" male and say, and plug them into a particular range. You'd expect their heart to be smaller, as most of their organs would be smaller. And Mr. Floyd was a very tall, robust-looking individual. So I would expect him to have a larger heart. And so the type of study, such as the Mayo study, where they put in the sex of the individual, male, the height and the weight, and then come out with, as part of that calculation, accounting for that, the 95th inclusion rate would top out at 510 grams in the circumstance. So Mr. Floyd's heart weight at 540 is outside this range. I will tell you, there are multiple studies. There's another one out of Chicago and Northwestern University, which has even broader range and would indicate that Mr. Floyd was within the 95 centile, but still right up at the very top end of normal. Bottom line is, he has an enlarged heart.
Okay, if we could unpublish this, Your Honor. So in terms of, that's what you ultimately kind of see as relevant evidence here is that Mr. Floyd had an enlarged heart.
Yes.
How does the size of the heart affect the blood supply, nutrients, oxygen, things of that nature?
The heart is a muscle, and it's dependent on the supply of oxygen, glucose, and other important nutrients to function. When a heart or any other muscle grows in size, its consumption of those vital components increases. So Mr. Floyd's heart would have twice the need of those nutrients compared to a 260 gram heart, 270 gram heart, which would be halfway. It would be right in the middle of the Molina study criteria. Because there's just twice as much heart muscle to support, and each of those cells is bigger and requires more oxygen.
So it's kind of like the law of supply and demand, right?
Correct.
All right. What happens to a person when they experience a lack of supply, so to speak?
So like every other organ, the heart has certain reserves of energy built in. The typical amount of reserve in our brains is enough for us to maintain consciousness for about 10 to 15 seconds. And that is the organ which is most sensitive to constant supply.
The heart or the brain?
No, the brain. The heart is the next. But like other organs, it will be able to maintain function even when the supply is reduced or even completely cut off. But at some point, you do have to resupply, because those reserves are, when the heart is being exerted, are being used. And you either have to completely replace them, or if you only partially replace them, at some point, you're going to exhaust the reserves.
So how do we replenish the supply, so to speak?
The replenishment comes through the coronary arteries, and they bring blood into the heart. As that blood arrives, it delivers oxygen and other nutrients, and it also removes the byproducts of the metabolism of those heart muscles as they contract.
So what type of symptoms might someone who show if they are diminished in their supply?
So at some point, there are a variety of symptoms that can result. You can feel your heart racing. You may even get palpitations. You get potentially short of breath. And in some circumstances, you may start getting chest pain, what we refer to as angina. And it can get even worse than that. You can have sudden symptoms, such as a collapse, without any warning that there's a spectrum of different symptoms that can occur.
So when the supply isn't being met, what would a person customarily do to replenish the supply?
Well, when one becomes short of breath, you tend to relax, ease up, back off, stop walking, stop running, stop exercising until such time as you feel like you've got your heart rate down. Some people monitor their heart while they're exercising to ensure they don't go over certain limits. So there are different ways of doing it. But typically, if you experience symptoms, it's your body telling you, slow down.
And what happens if someone doesn't do that?
If you don't, and you don't heed those warnings, or you can't heed those warnings because of other circumstances, the consumption of those of those essential metabolites goes on, the production of the products of contraction, which need to be removed, continues to increase, and at some point, the heart will fail, have a sudden cardiac arrest, arrhythmia. That's what you expect to see.
So this doctor doesn't really seem like he's pushing the agenda on Floyd yet. I mean, I haven't seen his full testimony, but so far right here, the way he's kind of, and he volunteered another study that put Floyd's heart closer to the median, and he didn't have to say that. So the fact that he volunteered something that really doesn't or may not support his position, he still put it out there. That's building credibility for me as a viewer of his testimony.
I mean, within the field of forensic pathology, what would you call the stopping of the heart?
We typically call it sudden cardiac arrest or cardiac arrhythmia.
What's the difference between sudden cardiac arrest and arrhythmia?
A sudden cardiac arrest really is an observational situation. You observe the person suddenly stop functioning. And usually the background process is an arrhythmia of some sort, often starting out as a relatively benign arrhythmia and then progressing into a more malignant arrhythmia, which then decreases the function of the heart and eventually the heart fails.
So what types of things might cause a heart to be bigger, like Mr. Floyd's?
The commonest one in the United States, which is part of the developing world, is hypertension, what we would call essential hypertension. It just happens.
And based on what you reviewed, did you determine whether Mr. Floyd had hypertension?
The size of the heart would be extremely good evidence that he had hypertension.
Why?
Secondly, there are medical records that I did see where he had an elevated...
I know why. Because when you have high blood pressure, your heart's working more all the time, so it tends to enlarge because it's working so much and it grows as a muscle. But he didn't have... I think he should have asked why does an enlarged heart connected with that.
Blood pressure at previous hospital administrations or previous clinical interactions. So yes, there's evidence that he had that. And then there was something else found at autopsy, a tumor that is sometimes associated with hypertension as well in certain people.
That's a paraganglioma?
Paraganglionoma, yes.
No, sorry. We will talk about that a little bit later. So just kind of generally, can you describe the major blood vessels of the heart?
Yes. There really are two major blood vessels, the right coronary artery and the left coronary artery. The left coronary artery, within a very short distance of coming off the aorta, divides into two major arteries, the left anterior descending and the left circumflex. So some people call it three coronary arteries, but technically there are two with one dividing into two. Neither description would be incorrect.
And what is narrowing or stenosis of the arteries?
So narrowing or stenosis of the arteries means that the arteries, the lumen, the inside diameter of that artery is smaller than it should be. It has been narrowed by a disease process.
How does long-term drug use affect narrowing of the arteries?
There are certain drugs that do cause advanced or more rapidly advancing atherosclerosis. Not just drugs, but many substances and toxins, even smoking, for instance, is associated with earlier atherosclerosis. And certain drugs and other drugs, substances...
They didn't cover that, but Floyd was a smoker, and I kind of thought they've dropped that a little bit on his health issues. He was a smoker. He had nicotine. He had caffeine. He had fentanyl. He had methamphetamine. He had that Suboxone or Subanol. I mean, he just had a multitude of different chemicals he was putting in, not to mention his own adrenaline from his tumor in his gland.
Can be added on to that particular. So even urban pollution has a risk of advancing heart disease.
What specific drugs?
Well, in this particular case, methamphetamine, which was present in Mr. Floyd, has been associated with earlier onset of narrowing of the coronary arteries by atherosclerosis.
And can you describe the difference between proximal and distal narrowing of the arteries?
Right. So the narrowing can occur anywhere up and down the artery. When it occurs close to its origin, i.e. close to the aorta where the blood supply comes from, we will call that proximal. If it occurs far down the artery towards the end of the artery, or further down the artery, it's called distal. The implications are somewhat different. And if you have narrowing close to the beginning of the artery, anything downstream from that narrowing is subject to decreased supply of blood. If you have it further down in distal, then the first part and all the branches that come off the first part are supplying that heart, and that part of the heart will still receive enough supply. It's not restricted. But once you get to beyond the narrowing, any tissue, heart tissue, muscle, downstream from that is going to be subjected to a reduced supply. And so in this particular case, he had significant narrowing of all of his coronary arteries close to their origin, which really is consistent with all of his heart, unfortunately, being subjected to reduced supply, not just a portion of his heart, but the entire heart.
Is there a certain amount of narrowing that forensic pathologists consider to be enough to cause sudden death?
So the typical conventional number that forensic pathologists use is between 70 and 75% narrowing is a risk factor for sudden cardiac death.
Can you survive with greater than 75% narrowing?
Oh, absolutely. I've seen many, many cases where it can be 90, 95%. Again, it depends where on the artery it is. So a proximal narrowing is more dangerous than a distal narrowing because only part of the heart. And in this particular case, we know Mr. Floyd had 90% narrowing, so he was walking around with 90% stenosis beyond the 75, and that was not affecting him as part of his daily activities. So when he was at rest, walking around, doing his normal daily activities, I know of no information that he was symptomatic or having any problems. So yes, you can go beyond 75%.
That's what cardiologists may conclude you can survive with greater than 75%?
Yeah, so I think the difference is that medical examiners see people who've died with 75%, and cardiologists see people who are walking around with 90%. So they see the live population, we see the dead population. And so we probably end up with different standards based on, unfortunately, that's what we see.
So in terms of an autopsy finding, can you describe what myocyte necrosis is and whether that's necessary to diagnose a sudden cardiac death?
So myocyte necrosis is both something you can, you have to visualize it microscopically. You have to look at the individual heart cell. The myocyte is just a word which is heart cell. You can infer that there may be myocyte necrosis at autopsy if you see bleeding into the heart itself. But it is a microscopic diagnosis, and it is not necessary for myocyte necrosis to be present for sudden cardiac death.
So someone who has a sudden cardiac death may not have myocyte necrosis?
Correct.
Why might that happen? Why might someone not have that myocyte necrosis?
Again, the heart goes through a process of dying. It takes a while for a heart to die and for the actual myocytes to start showing the changes that we can see under a microscope. And we need to understand that that's why you can do heart transplants. And somebody who has been injured or suffered some other catastrophe to their brain, is brain dead, and is a donor, their heart can be removed, put on ice, flown across the country, and put into another person without any damage to that heart. And that process takes hours. So if the death is rapid, you will not see myocyte necrosis. It's the time frame from the heart stopping. So the time we typically see myocyte necrosis is going to be somebody who has had symptoms and survived for a period of time so that that process can advance to the degree where we can see it under the microscope.
Okay. Now, you've kind of talked about sudden cardiac events. Let's talk about the arrhythmia. Can you describe what is called the conduction system of the heart?
The conduction system of the heart is a very important part of the orderly contraction of our heart. We have two chambers which receive blood from the body, the atria, and then we have two bigger, very muscular chambers, the ventricles, that pump blood under high pressure to the body. And so the way the heart works is it's a two-chamber on each side. The one side supplying the lungs and the other side supplying the body, where the atria contract and push blood into the ventricles to fill them up. And then the ventricles contract to push blood to the body. The ventricles are very powerful, and there's a valve in between them to stop the blood flowing back. So what you need is an orderly contraction process where the atria contract first, followed by the ventricles. This is coordinated by the conduction system. And we have in the heart what is known as the cardiac pacemaker. It's a generic term, but it's the little piece of modified heart muscle that actually has almost nerve-like function.
Does it have a name? Sorry.
It's called a sinoatrial node. And that generates the initial activity which causes the atria to start contracting, and between it and another node, which is at the junction of the atria and the ventricles, called the atrioventricular node, there is a little...
This guy's explaining it better than the other doctor. Maybe I just didn't like the other doctors because I thought they were full of crap and bought and paid for. But this guy seems to be explaining it a little bit better for me.
Bundle of modified heart muscles that conduct that down, and then there are further modified heart muscles that go down to spread the impulse, the electrical impulse, to the heart to cause it to contract.
What are those called?
That's, it's the bundle of his Purkinje fibers, etc. They will have medical terminology, but basically it's modified heart muscle cells. So what that does is the sinoatrial node fires, and the impulse is conducted down the fibers to the AV node. At that time, the atria contract, forcing blood into. At the time that the impulse arrives at the ventricles, that node then fires shortly after the atria, and the heart contracts and sends the blood on its way. So you get this orderly double beat to the heart. You can hear the valves opening and closing, atria first and then the ventricles, and that's the sound that the physician listens to when he puts a stethoscope over your heart.
That's like the blood pressure?
Sorry?
Is that blood pressure? Or?
So the blood pressure is actually generated by the contraction of the ventricles. That's the essential output of the heart, is directly related to the volume and the pressure of blood that is pushed out of the heart.
Okay. So what happens if this conduction system gets impaired?
Then you don't have orderly contraction of the heart. And so if they fire at the wrong time, then if you had the atria and ventricles firing at the same time, you would move no blood. The ventricles are very powerful. They slam that valve shut. The atria fire at the same time. They can't force blood past it, and so you've got no flow to fill the ventricles.
And is that an arrhythmia?
That's an arrhythmia. So there are multiple different types of arrhythmias that are documented.
And what can happen? Can sudden death happen as a result of an arrhythmia?
Absolutely.
So which artery supplies that pacemaker, the SA node that you described?
The sinoatrial node is supplied by a small branch that comes off the right coronary artery.
And did you review, again, the autopsy and observe findings relevant to Mr. Floyd's right coronary artery?
Yes, so unfortunately, that was the artery which showed the greatest degree of narrowing,
Which was how much?
90%.
Does that increase, or that type of narrowing increase the risk for sudden death?
Yes, in that if and when the blood supply needs of the heart on the right side increase, and that's also going to apply to the sinoatrial node, are not met, that sinoatrial node will not function properly and will not fire properly, and you will end up with an arrhythmia of some sort.
So essentially, if it misfires, there's no pacemaker, right? Or
That is correct, yes.
how does exertion come into the analysis?
Exertion basically increases the demand for oxygen throughout the entire body, mostly because of the muscular activity. So as we exercise, our heart rate and our breathing rate normally compensate to increase the oxygen that we're bringing into the body through the respiratory system and increase the amount of blood, or amount of oxygenated blood, which is being distributed to the body. And the way that increase of blood, the way the body increases the blood supply is to increase the rate of the heart. So we will go from our resting heart rates, which are somewhere between 60 and 100, we'll push it up to 120, 140, 150, depending on the degree of exertion. And beyond, it gets dangerous.
So essentially, the more exertion, the more oxygenated blood is needed.
Yes.
How do drugs like methamphetamine come into play, as far as in terms of the conduction system?
So methamphetamine is dangerous at several levels in this particular case. One, it has known arrhythmogenic potential. In other words, it sensitizes the heart to arrhythmias. It makes, it's just been documented that people on methamphetamine have an increased risk of an arrhythmia. Secondly, it increases the rate that the heart beats at. As a stimulant, it pushes the heartbeat rate up. So therefore, the heart is now going to demand increased oxygen, the heart muscle itself. And thirdly, it is a vasoconstrictor.
What is a vasoconstrictor?
So a vasoconstrictor is a substance which causes blood vessels, usually arteries, to narrow. And it's physiologically important, and it is protected in certain circumstances, but can become dangerous in others. And the way a vasoconstrictor works in most circumstances is to act on the muscular layer that's present in arteries. Arteries have multiple different layers, and there's a muscular layer in there, and it causes that muscular layer to begin to contract. A little bit of contraction, that's good. Too much contraction, and it can slow down the blood beyond what is necessary, and even in certain circumstances, you can stop the blood by giving a vasoconstrictor substance.
Okay. So in this particular case, we've got an enlarged heart, right?
Yes.
We have a heart that has narrowed coronary arteries, right?
Yes.
And based on your review of the video evidence, you observed a pretty significant struggle between Mr. Floyd and the three officers.
Correct.
Methamphetamine on board, which is a vasoconstrictor.
Yes.
Have you or your colleagues ever certified a death due to the atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease?
Yes, it's a unfortunately very common cause of death.
And even at these levels of narrowing, 75 and 90?
Anything above 75%, as I previously mentioned, meets the criteria for enough narrowing, at least within the community of practicing forensic pathologists.
Have you ever performed an autopsy sort of expecting one cause of death but finding another?
That's why we perform autopsies. It is a thorough internal examination to identify anatomic deviations from normal, and so therefore your preconceived notion, I wouldn't say a common example, but we see it every now and then, would be a motor vehicle collision, where somebody has multiple injuries, and you look at them and go, okay, they've got enough injury there to kill them. But when you go in, you can see evidence that they had a stroke or a heart attack. And that's what potentially caused them to lose control of their vehicle at the time that they had and got all their multiple injuries. And so then we sit with the issue of, do we put the heart attack under part 1, or do we put the heart attack and or the stroke type findings under significant conditions? Because obviously they were driving their vehicle, but it may have caused them to lose consciousness. So these are just dilemmas that we face as to where you put things on a death certificate. And sometimes You're not right and you're not wrong.
How about hypertensive cardiovascular disease? How does that relate to a cause of death?
So again, there are a number of sudden cardiac deaths that are related solely and exclusively to the increased size of the heart. And so those are the ones that, since hypertensive disease is the most common cause of an enlarged heart, we will typically use that as the cause of death and say hypertensive cardiovascular disease.
Have you ever certified a death due to hypertensive cardiovascular disease?
Yes, I have, multiple times.
Have you diagnosed both hypertension and coronary artery disease as a cause of death in combination?
Yes, and again, that is probably even more common because a significant proportion of the population have hypertension, so their hearts are enlarged, and as you get older, you tend to lay down deposits of material in your arteries, and so there's often both are present in many, many cases, unfortunately.
Now, again, in terms of hypertensive cardiovascular disease, we talked earlier about kind of the struggle between Mr. Floyd and the officers getting into the squad car. How does that type of exertion play into hypertensive cardiovascular disease?
It increases, both with the hypertensive and the atherosclerotic, it increases the demand and the stress on the heart. And the more the individual is stressed, both physically and in other ways, the more the demand on the heart is going to increase.
So in terms of stress, right, how does that affect the heart?
So we have certain innate stress mechanisms built into us, reflexes built into us. It's called the fight and flight reflex. It's the common terminology that you will see within the medical literature and also within the lay literature. And this is a mechanism where if you are in a stressful situation, it prepares your body to be able to cope with the stressful situation. And what happens generally is the sympathetic part of your nervous system begins to act. That causes secretion of adrenaline, as one of the examples, and perhaps other catecholamines, which are substances that are part of that sympathetic nervous system. And adrenaline causes some of your blood vessels to constrict. It's another potent vasoconstrictor. The idea being that you don't need to digest the food in your stomach, for instance, while you're in a very, very dangerous environment. So it really shunts the blood, pushes the blood to the organs that are more important: the heart, the lungs, the brain, your muscles. It also shuts down the blood supply to your skin. So it does all of those things. But it also speeds up the heart to increase the cardiac output, to maintain oxygenation of the brain, your muscles, and other things, so that you can have an additional reserve to fight that threat.
All right. Now, so the fight or flight kind of that you described, it increases adrenaline, right? It causes the heart to beat faster. Agreed?
Yes and yes.
And the adrenaline, how does that come into play? Did you say that was a vasoconstrictor?
So adrenaline is a vasoconstrictor, yes.
Including the arteries?
Oh, yes.
And ultimately, what does that do, potentially?
So it narrows the arteries. And again, we have smooth muscle in the cardiac arteries. So there's a potential of the adrenaline and the methamphetamine further narrowing those arteries in the heart, as well as arteries elsewhere in the body, restricting blood flow.
Now, in terms of that kind of stress reaction, I would like to craft this question carefully. The jury saw some evidence, which I know you reviewed as well, of an incident in 2019, about a year prior to Mr. Floyd's death, where Mr. Floyd was stopped by the police, was seen or believed and admitted to ingesting some controlled substances at that point, and was subsequently seen by paramedics. Do you recall that information in the information you reviewed generally?
I did.
And at the time that he was initially seen by paramedics, his blood pressure was taken, and if I'm not mistaken, it was 216/160. What does that signify to you as far as this stress relation?
So a high blood pressure like that, and that's markedly elevated, could be due to his hypertension being out of control. But this is much higher than I would expect. Secondly, it could be part of the stress reaction where adrenaline is being secreted and it's pushing his heart rate up, and that will increase your blood pressure. And if adrenaline is secreted, it's also causing vasoconstriction. So there's more blood staying within the central vasculature, and so therefore that will also increase your blood pressure. There are multiple explanations for that, but certainly stress would be one of them.
Okay. Your Honor, I believe that right now would be a good time for our mid-morning break.
Minutes, let's reconvene at 11:10.
Okay. So I think he's doing a pretty good job. He's walking them through. Again, the goal of this witness is to undo the 3 paid, I say again, paid, went out and bought and paid for their testimony by the prosecution. They're paid opinions that totally supported the prosecution and totally ignored. I mean, we've heard testimony that 90% blockage is no problem. We heard that most smokers don't have any lung problems. I mean, pretty much Floyd was in the best health of all of us, even though he had Subinol, methamphetamine, marijuana, fentanyl, nicotine, and caffeine in his system. He was eating drugs, COVID-19 positive, fighting with the cops. He had 90% blockage. He had high blood pressure. He was a smoker, and he has a tumor that may increase his adrenaline. But according to all the experts on the prosecution side, he was in the best health of all of us. All right, we'll end that there and come back when the doctor comes back.